I call the member for Bradfield.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm pleased to rise to speak on the Australian Energy Market Amendment National Energy Retail Law Bill, and I'm pleased to follow the member for Chifley, who has significant experience working in both the energy sector and the communications sector, both networked industries, and I note that there is a growing number of members of parliament with experience working in the networked industries. I don't think that is a coincidence, because across the broad sector of network industries there has been a program of deregulation, competition, liberalisation for some 20 years, and that has led to growth, it's led to opportunities, and it's led to, I would argue, the increasing importance of those sectors within the national economy. That is a good thing, and I argue that it is also a good thing that people with experience working in those sectors are now serving in the national parliament. The bill that is before us is part of the long-term program to reform the national energy market. Its effect is to amend the Australian Energy Market Act 2004 so that that amended act will apply the National Energy Retail Law, a law which is set out in the South Australian Act of 2011, which itemises the specific provisions of that law. It forms part of the cooperative Commonwealth, State and Territory regime to regulate the non-economic distribution and retail regulation of gas and energy. The National Energy Retail Law has this to say as a statement of its objective. The objective of this law is to promote efficient investment in and efficient operation and use of energy services for the long-term interests of consumers of energy with respect to price, quality, safety, reliability and security of supply of energy. And in its operations, this bill confers key powers on the Australian Energy Market Commission and the Australian Energy Regulator. The Australian Energy Market Commission is the national rule-making and development body in electricity and gas, and the Australian Energy Regulator regulates electricity and gas transmission and distribution, and included within that pricing. Now, the provisions of this bill in one sense are procedural, but they are important nevertheless in facilitating the nationally consistent application of the National Energy Retail Law and National Energy Retail Rules. And they do represent yet a further stage in the implementation of a set of measures which goes back to a process initiated by the Council of Australian Government's 2002 Energy Market Review, entitled Towards a Truly National and Efficient Energy Market. In the brief time available to me, I want to make three key points. Firstly, as I've already indicated, these reforms are part of the broader competition reform process in Australia, which began some 20 years ago and has played out over that period, and energy is clearly one of the most important sectors where reform has occurred. I secondly want to highlight the tensions between that reform process and the Gillard government's stated policy in relation to the carbon tax. And I also want to highlight some inconsistencies with developments in another parallel market, which is telecommunications. Let me start then by talking about the broad competition reform process, which in many ways goes back to the Hilmer Review reporting in 1993. That report noted that at that time government businesses accounted for 10% of Australia's GDP, with rail, electricity, gas and water utilities alone accounting for nearly 5% of GDP, and the report noted that improving the efficiency of these sectors remains a national priority. The report went on to say, while there have been some encouraging improvements, progress is being made from a low base, and Australian public enterprise productivity levels remain well below international best practice. For important industries such as rail, electricity and telecommunications, most Australian enterprises are achieving only 75% or less of the productivity levels achieved elsewhere. So that, therefore, was the starting point in the early 1990s when the Hilmer Review reported. Triggered by that review and some other processes, we saw the carrying out of a reform process over a number of years in the gas and electricity sectors, as well as a whole range of other sectors. But in the gas and electricity sectors, what we saw was the separation of a previously vertically integrated supply chain. We saw the introduction of competition between generators and retailers. We saw that network elements became subject to access and price regulation. There was the creation of the national electricity market, and gas pipelines became subject to third-party access. Progress on this reform agenda was reviewed in 2002. And if you go back and look at the 2002 review, it does make some interesting reading, some 9 years later. It opens with the observation that Australia is endowed with significant, diverse and high-quality energy resources. It cited figures of 800 years' supply of brown coal and 290 years' supply of black coal, large natural gas resources in the northwest, in Bass Strait, in the Cooper Basin, and it also referred to good wind, hydro and solar resources. The report went on to note that Australia's electricity and gas prices, this is speaking in 2002, are close to the lowest in the developed world for both major industrial and residential users. And it made this observation, which I would suggest remains as timely today as it was in 2002. Energy is a critical strategic policy matter for the Australian economy. It underpins the competitiveness of our exported goods sector. It is a vital ingredient for domestic industry, and it is a very important item in the monthly household expenditure budget. Now, a key objective of the program of the national competition reforms was to improve productivity. As Gary Banks, the chairman of the Productivity Commission, observed in a speech in 2000, really talking about progress which had been achieved to that point, a key benefit of the reform agenda was to reduce prices. He had this to say: the increased competition that has come with these reforms has also helped to ensure that the productivity improvements have benefited consumers through consequent reductions in prices and improvements in quality. For example, household and industrial users have benefited from declines in real electricity prices in the 1990s averaging around 16%. Declines in the 1990s averaging around 16%. Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, how things have changed. How things have changed. Because if we turn to the second point that I wanted to highlight, there is a real tension between this policy agenda, the bill before us today, which implements one of the components of that policy agenda, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the direction that the Gillard government has been pursuing when it comes to carbon tax. Because we now have a government going in deliberately and directly the opposite direction from the one which was cited so approvingly by Gary Banks in 2000, and from the direction which underpinned the competition reforms going back to the start of the 90s. We have seen, as I don't need to remind anybody in this House, a promise by the Prime Minister in 2010 that there would be no carbon tax under a government she led, and of course we subsequently saw in February 2011 a complete reversal of direction. And what is significant about that, Madam Deputy Speaker, apart from the issues of integrity and trust, what is significant about that is that you have the Gillard government in substance reversing the policy direction which has been pursued in energy markets for many years. Since December 2007, electricity prices across Australia have risen by an average of 50% and gas by an average of 30%. And what a stark contrast that is, Madam Deputy Speaker, to the track record of improvements in competition and efficiency and reduction in prices in the 1990s, which I cited earlier. And of course, what we can now expect is further sharp increases in electricity prices, stimulated in part by the carbon tax.
The member for Bradford could just resume his seat for a moment. Minister, on a point of order.
Madam Deputy Speaker, standing in accordance with the standing orders for the main committee, will the honourable member take a question with respect to the cause of the current increases in electricity prices?
Member for Bradfield, will you allow a question? Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I ask the honourable member, does he accept the statements by the member for Groom reported in the Australian on the 21st and 20th of August last year, when he stated that power prices in Australia are likely to double in the next 5 to 7 years, regardless of who is in government. Does he also accept that in making those statements, the member for Groom indicated that he recognised that irrespective of who is in government, these electricity prices would occur, because they are a result of the requirements for investment across Australia to ensure that electricity supply reliability and security continues to meet community reliability standards, that is, relating to maintaining the existing distribution networks.
I thank the Minister for the question and the opportunity to answer it. And the point that I would make in answering the question is that in an environment where prices are expected to rise, it's extraordinary that what you would then do is stick on a discretionary tax which is likely to increase prices by a further 20%. And that is the consequence of this government's policy, and that is why I say, and we say on this side of the House, that there's been a complete reversal in policy direction by this government.
Yes.
Thank you for that reassurance. Madam Deputy Speaker, Madam Deputy Speaker, the 2002 review, which I cited earlier, noted correctly that our low energy prices are a huge competitive advantage, and it is clearly, therefore, a matter of considerable concern that we have such a sharp and direct reversal in policy direction by this government. And what is further concerning is that a consequence of the carbon tax policies being pursued by this government is that there is a key negative effect on major sectors of energy generation. The New South Wales government, for example, estimates a $5 billion loss in the values of its black coal-based generation assets. So it is very hard to understand why it makes sense to, on the one hand, be pursuing a continuation of the energy market reform process, while, on the other hand, introducing a completely separate policy which goes in the opposite direction. The other thing that is very interesting in the 2002 review is that it highlights the importance of certainty in the regulatory regime applying to the energy sector for the purpose of encouraging investment. I cannot imagine that the authors of that review would have predicted a scenario in which a government would be elected in 2007 promising an emissions trading scheme, would in 2010 abandon that policy, would later in 2010 make a solemn promise to the Australian people that there would be no carbon tax, and then in February 2011 announce capriciously and with no notice that there now would be a carbon tax. The degree of uncertainty facing the industry has been ramped up beyond what might reasonably have been expected or predicted when this review was written in 2002. The third point I want to make in the very brief time that remains to me is to highlight the difference, the contrast between the reform agenda in energy and the way in which the reform agenda has gone wildly off track in the telecommunications sector. These are two networked industries with very considerable similarities. The regulatory frameworks are in many ways quite similar. Both were the subject of competition policy reforms throughout the 1990s. In the energy sector, the Gillard government is at least nominally continuing to implement the Howard government's reform agenda, albeit undermined, as I've noted, by its contrasting policy direction to do with the carbon tax. But it is very noteworthy that when it comes to telecommunications, there's been a complete reversal of a reliance on competition. This government has effectively abandoned competition. If you compare it to the electricity sector, where there's been a continued reliance on the existing assets in the sector, rather than the government building new assets, where companies have been permitted to continue to operate based upon their current ownership structure, rather than an effective policy of nationalisation, where existing players have been structurally separated through breaking up vertically integrated companies into generation, transmission and distribution, as opposed to this spurious argument we hear in the telecommunications sector that the only way to achieve structural separation is to build a brand new company at vast government expense, and where in the energy sector there has continued to be a commendable reliance on competition. The comparison is not a favourable one, and I make the point that is one of the many ways in which policy in these areas is rife with internal contradictions.